am Adrienne Johnson-Martin. I'm the managing editor of Duke's Alumni Magazine. Before I was the managing editor of Duke's Alumni Magazine, I spent many years as a print journalist at the LA Times and at the Raleigh News and Observer. And so this topic has a lot of resonance for me. But even beyond that, as a parent, navigating this whole sort of new thing of this separating fact and fiction has been interesting. So I can assume that you all have those kind of different connections to it. So I look forward to this really being a great conversation. Our panel is made up of people too who have different perspectives and different takes on this issue. So let me get to introducing them. I'll start at the end. We have Sunshine Hillygus, who is a professor of political science and public policy here at Duke. She specializes in public opinion, political communication, and survey methodology. She's the author of 3 books, one of which just came out, and she has a copy
yesterday.
Next, we have Erika Henry, who is not just an alum, but a parent of a junior.
Yes, we just made a cameo.
Left. She's the Southeast Regional Newsgathering Director at CNN. And in that role, she oversees the day-to-day operations for CNN's Atlanta and Miami bureaus. Some of the stories that she's contributed to that I'm sure you've heard of are stories on hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and the mass shootings at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High in Parkland. And before CNN, she was at NBC and MSNBC. And next to me is Hannah Rozear, who's a research librarian here at Duke. She's been here since 2011. She began working in the Divinity Library as a research librarian and then moved into research and instructional library position at Perkins. She's recently been engaged in scholarship and teaching on topics related to fake news, media manipulation, critical information literacy, and the impact of the internet on information in society. We thought we'd start with each of our panelists sort of giving their take on this topic. So let's start with Hannah.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here, and I'm kind of representing my perspective as a librarian here at Duke. I have most of my work is with library instruction for Writing 101, if you remember your first year writing course. We teach a research component there, and then recently I've been able to teach a course-long class on the Googleization of knowledge, which is in the Information Science and Studies department here at Duke. And I've also been, since 2016, when fake news became just kind of a buzzword, you couldn't get away from it. I've jumped on the train a little bit with many librarians and thinking about how we address that. And so I've taught workshops. One that I led for students was called How to Fake a Tweet. And then another one for instructors on how they could integrate fake news into the ways they were talking about information in their courses. So those are some of the ways I work here with students. So one thing, and there's a handout you'll see, is just kind of some highlights of what I'm talking about, but you don't need to go into it in depth. It was just some examples of my work. I wanted to mention that as a librarian, one of my main goals is to think about helping students develop the ability to judge the credibility of the information that floods them on their smartphones, on their computers, their tablets. That's kind of been a constant goal of librarians, is helping students understand, evaluate, and use information effectively. But I would say, since I became a librarian, oops, sorry, touched my microphone there, it's become much more not how to use the library, but how to use the internet and how to make sense of everything. So I've found my role changing more and more from just teaching this traditional, here's how to use the library, to here's what information means, here's how you encounter it on a daily basis. And that's actually made my work much more interesting, I think, just to think about all the ways that students are encountering information. So a little bit of what, I just wanted to share some things about what I've observed, and then kind of bigger sort of trends and studies about how students are encountering news in the 21st century a little bit. So one thing is that I find it's important to state that students haven't necessarily changed in their news consumption habits. Many students have a lot going on when they're in college, and they're not necessarily just constantly reading the news. And so I think that hasn't changed as much, but what's changed is they have a phone in their pocket that gives them access to everything, every bit of knowledge they could want to find, and they can find that immediately, and they're constantly connected. And the thing that's changed a whole lot is the role of social media and the way they're exposed to issues, topics, alerts from certain news organizations. So I think that in some ways, things haven't changed drastically in terms of how students are thinking about the news, but just the amount of information has changed drastically. And I think about how they get news passively, just scrolling through their feeds of social media. And then if there's a topic they're interested in, then I would say, like, they go and they Google it, and they are confronted with what Google presents them. And so that's just kind of a process that I've found is pretty common among students. I have a student I'm instructing this semester in an independent study, and he talked about how he first saw a post on Twitter that Kobe Bryant had died. So he went on Google, and he Googled it, and he found a TMZ article that said he had died. And he thought to himself, what's TMZ? That's the first site that popped up, but what is that? And he did a little background research and found it's a celebrity gossip site, something a lot of students probably encounter just because of that news being popular and coming up a lot in their feed. And then he saw some corroborating tweets and kind of decided, okay, like, I'm not sure about TMZ, but this is, like, I think that this is a thing. So that's just, I think, a good example of how students are kind of finding out about something because it's posted somewhere, and then they kind of go and look a little bit further. And my goal would be for them to evaluate, what is TMZ, what does it mean that this is there but not on another news site. So those are some of the things that I think are kind of interesting. I just want to quickly mention that some of the big studies lately have found that there's a 2018 project information literacy study that was kind of a big scale study, that students get their news when asked where they got it in the past week from peers was the number one place, 93%, social media, and their professors, and then it kind of trails off in some other sources. So it's kind of an interesting study of where they get the news. Another 2016 Stanford study that was pretty prominent in the library circles was that they presented K-12 and college students with a bunch of different information sources and found their ability to evaluate those sources was pretty poor. And some of the sources they presented to them were, for example, students are all taught, I think, in high school that .orgs are okay, those are good sites. And there's a kind of advocacy-based site called the American College of Pediatrics, which is a really kind of a politically charged group that has a really slick website. They've got a .org, and when students were presented with this, even college students, they thought, oh, this looks good, it passes the sniff test, and that's kind of some of the steps they are taught in high school. So those are some interesting things. I also just lastly, a big study is this one that came out in January of 2020 about it says we're living in the age of algorithms and the importance that algorithms have and how information is presented to students. And those algorithms could be social media or Google, and the fact of the matter is they kind of present you filtered responses based on your habits, your browsing behavior, and your social networks. So it has a real influence on what you see when you search. So just a few takeaways that I have is in terms of what I think is important for students to think about and to like prepare them for a lifelong learning are that I think it's important to teach them to be fact checkers. So no matter what the site is, they should open up a new tab and Google the name of that site and see who is this group? Why are they putting out this information? They need to kind of do more digging in terms of the information presented to them. The other thing is that I think it's important to teach students to be skeptical, but to ideally not have them be cynical about all information. I think we're living in the age of cynicism. And one of the stats that from this recent study was that most students, 82% think news is important to democracy, yet 36% said they don't trust any news, no matter what source it comes from. That was in this Project Information Literacy report. And I thought that stat was very mind-blowing to me, to think of a third of students thinking, I don't trust anything, I'll just move on and go through my life. And then lastly, I just think it's important for us to be teaching students about bias and their own blind spots. So this idea that the social media they're on can really filter the types of stories they're seeing, the kinds of posts they're seeing, and it's important for everyone to kind of recognize those biases and try to diversify what sites they're going to for information. So that's just kind of my quick take on sort of what I'm seeing and what some of the bigger, more recent studies are in terms of how students encounter news. And I look forward to kind of further discussion as we open things up.
So separating fact from fiction, that is literally what I do all day, every day. And, say what you want to say about CNN, and I'm not getting into politics, I'm not getting into anything, but the one thing I will say about CNN is when news happens, people actually go to CNN and, either on their phone, on their computer, digitally, on television, like you hear something and then you say, well, I have to go to, what is CNN saying? More than any other organization, it's just something that happens, and that's like we have the document, the stats to back that up and to prove it. And I can't tell you how much of my day is spent batting stories down just to make sure that we have to protect that reputation and protect that brand, because once CNN says that somebody's dead, that's it. You cannot go back, and and it doesn't matter how long we've said, it doesn't matter how many minutes later we waited to report the information. And, Kobe Bryant is definitely, an example that, CNN was very, very, very painstakingly and took time to make sure, because, no matter, if we were wrong, that's what everybody would have, we being CNN, if we were wrong, that's what everybody would have jumped on, right? And so, that is exactly what we do. The other day, Thursday, I'm sorry, my days are blending in. There was a story on social media, because actually a lot of what I do is we have a company that aggregates tweets for us, and it sends it to us. And if something is trending on social media, they'll send us an email and they'll say, hey, you might want to be interested in the story, because a lot of people are talking about it on Twitter right now. And so there was a tweet that came out of Dallas that that reported that a very popular Dallas Cowboy football player was shot and possibly killed in Dallas. And so, and social media lit up. And we spent a long time, going back, seeing who this the first person that sent the tweet, when we went back and looked into that person, they only had 80 followers. That's your first, hint that this is not true. And then what I found very interesting about that story was that because it was trending and it was going so quickly and it was blowing up on social media, the Dallas Police Department, they actually had to send out a tweet to because they couldn't keep up with all of the people who were calling them and, and trying to reach out to them and trying to see if this Dallas Cowboy football player had died. But I found it very interesting that now the agencies, the police departments, they're now using social media too as a way to get out and say, hey guys, we're just going to tell you right off the bat, that's not true. Now, in the past 4 years, in 2016, because of the fake news moniker, that has gotten, we are associated. CNN is associated in a lot of circles as being part of fake news. And so I have reporters who report to me, and they'll go out and they'll be reporting on a story about nothing that has to do with politics. And now we're faced with, people coming up to us and saying, I don't speak to you because I don't believe in fake news. And so, but when they speak to my reporters and my producers, they'll say, okay, I know you feel that way, but come over here and let's talk. And once, we build that face-to-face interaction, then people that, will usually, their guard will come down and they'll say, okay, I'll talk to you. And then we're able to kind of glisten and glean and get information out. But it's unfortunate that in this day and age, when people automatically, when they hear, CNN, there are some people that say fake news, and that's not true. I mean, we spend a lot of time, and we are painstaking to make sure that that we try to make sure that what we're presenting to you via mobile, via desktop, via television is as accurate as it is. And I can't tell you for every one story that, I won't say for every one story, but for every, 10 stories that you see on mobile, we are batting down 100, a day, because they're just not accurate. And so that, like I said, so my day is spending separating facts.
So, hello, thank you for being here on a wintry day in Durham. I know, right? So I am professor of political science and public policy. I also direct the initiative on survey methodology at SSRI at Duke and co-director of the Polarization Lab. So spend a lot of my research thinking about misinformation, the effects on the public, and how misinformation might get communicated. And I think that we're all aware of the concerns. And what I like to do when given the opportunity to speak to non-academics is kind of be the academic curmudgeon and bring some of the evidence to perhaps challenge some of the things that you might have thought about from journalistic headlines. And with the topic of misinformation, I thought I had a chance to do that again. And so what I wanted to do is give you 3 facts, insights that I think might offer some degree of reassurance about misinformation and the potential threat that people feel right now about levels of misinformation in American democracy. So the first point that I'll make regards the public. So it is very common to see headlines in all newspapers and media outlets that talk about how the American public believes something really crazy, right? So I pulled up a couple of those recent headlines. An astonishing number of Americans believe in Pizzagate. Another one was about the surprising number who believe that Ted Cruz is a Zodiac killer. A third of millennials believe that the earth is flat. A surprising number of Americans believe chocolate milk comes from brown cows. Right? There are headlines frequently in the newspaper, right, talking about some poll that has found that this astonishing number of people believe something that we think is pretty crazy. And the thing that I want to tell you is that the polls that produce those headlines are often crap, right? And so I want to reassure you that the American public, just because the polls say so, and I should emphasize that all of my research uses polling, but that there's a particular use of polls that ends up generating numbers like some 50% of Republicans believe in Pizzagate, that is in fact not accurate. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. One is about the way that the question is worded as if it's an attitude rather than a fact. worded in a way that the response options don't distinguish between confidence in something that somebody has perhaps not held and actual belief in it. And then there's the fact that you ask a dumb question, you get a dumb answer. And there are a lot of people out there that now do what I call is trolling the survey. So in one study that I did, I found that 50% of the people who reported that they believed in Pizzagate were in fact just trolling the survey. So on the one hand, that makes my job more difficult as a pollster to actually separate fact from fiction. On the other hand, it also means that it's very easy for things that are not accurate reflections of the American public to make its way into the type of perception. We know that misinformation is out there. What I just want to give reassurance on is that the American public doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily susceptible to all of that, believing that misinformation. George Gallup used to use this saying that I teach to my students, and that is, you should never overestimate the knowledge of the American public, but you should never underestimate their intelligence, right? So people don't know a lot of information about facts and figures when you ask them, but it doesn't mean that they're going to fall for every bit of misinformation that we see floating out there. So that brings me to the second point that, again, I think is a piece of evidence to offer some reassurance. We all have heard the horror stories about 2016 and the role of information, the attempts by foreign domestic actors to try and infiltrate, right, the information stream. There is very clear evidence about the role of the IRA in Russia in putting this information out into the social media environment. My colleagues and I at the Polarization Lab just had an article that was published in the Proceedings of the Academy of Sciences, in which we worked with Twitter, a survey firm, to evaluate the impact of those IRA Twitter trolls. What we found through multiple surveys and looking at the tweets and the Twitter activity of the people in our survey sample is that the effect of those trolls was precisely zero. So we looked at ideology, we looked at attitudes across a variety of issues, we looked at who they were following, we looked at changes, any potential changes that you could possibly imagine in terms of their Twitter behavior and their policy attitudes, and they didn't change. Now the reason they didn't change was a couple different things. One is it was exceptionally rare for people to actually be exposed to those Twitter trolls. So yes, there were a lot out there, and in fact, once we did the study, we found that people were a little bit more likely to be exposed than Twitter admitted, but it accounted for 0.01% of people's tweets. So the number one reason is just a tiny amount of the information fire hose that people were getting was part of those tweets. The second is that they were more likely to be received by people who were really politically sophisticated and already politically polarized. So the tweets were actually only reaching people that are among the hardest to change their minds. And finally, as someone who studied campaigns and elections for a very long time, or anybody who's been in the political world can tell you, it's really hard to change people's minds, right? Candidates spend millions of dollars attempting to do it and most often failing. It turns out the Russian trolls also weren't currently able to change minds. The third thing I would say is that looking across the studies that have tried to look to see are people kind of falling for these efforts by the misinformation trolls, is that the only small group of people who we find are likely to show any amount of influence tend to be older Americans. Younger people are far more skeptical of information, are far more able to navigate this social media environment in which they are coming to be exposed to politics. And so if we were to think about the future, yes, 2016, there's all kinds of reasons that we should be really concerned about the fact that the information was out there, that candidates and companies didn't do more to stop the flow of misinformation, that, that there are lots of reasons that we should be concerned, but I want to reassure you that it didn't necessarily have an impact on people. And when we look in the future, I think that we actually should have hope about the potential for young people to navigate this undeniably more complicated information environment. And that's where I will plug my new book that, even though it's not about misinformation, it's called Making Young Voters. It came out yesterday. I was on the State of Things today talking about it. That actually, when we think about the future of American democracy, that while young people don't vote, there's a lot of reason that we can have hope, right? That in fact, if they participate, that things are not quite as bleak as they sometimes seem these days.
You. I'd like to not believe that people think chocolate milk comes from ground up, although that's kind of a lovely thought in another way. I have a lot of questions, but does anyone else have questions? Or
Hi, my name is Lisa. I have a question related to your presentation. I've spoken with a few young voters, and although I understand what you're saying, that they have a greater ability to dissect the information, the misinformation about American politics being rigged, I've had several young millennials say to me, there's no point in voting. The system is fixed. My vote isn't going to count. And this has been, I feel, not necessarily related to 2016, but an ongoing perception. So how do we reverse that to get young people more engaged in this process?
If you are indulge me to make a case, one of the things that we talk about, my co-author, who's a Duke alum, PhD from public policy, is that we focus on the importance of rethinking civic education. So there's two different things that we think are critically important. One are electoral reforms. And it is very much the case that there is wide variation across states in the how, when, and what is needed in order to vote. And those rules can make it easier or harder for people to vote, and they have a disproportionate impact on people who are new voters. North Carolina, it's especially a mess because there have been so many changes and instability over the last few years, where we had pre-registration, then it was taken away, and then we had it again. We had voter ID, it was stopped, and then there was constitutional amendment, and now it's on hold. And what matters in terms of impact is not just exactly what the law is, but also perceptions about the law. And there was a youth advocacy group that told me that they sat North Carolina out in 2016 because it was just too confusing to figure out the rules in the game, and so they went and put their money in another state. So the rules of the game and that confusion is a real thing, and I think as a society, it's one of the things that we could do to help to improve youth turnout. The civic education is the other. Right now, the way civic education is taught is what we call bubble sheet civics, right? You teach a bunch of facts and figures about history and government and historic legal cases, and it's very disconnected from real politics today. And what we found is that in fact, that we ought to be teaching about the process, right? What exactly is involved in terms of registering and voting. What should you do if you go to the precinct to vote and they say you're not on the list, right? That's something that we're not teaching currently in the schools and ought to be doing. And finally, there are lots of ways that schools are essentially falling short. Public education was founded to create a citizenry that was engaged and able to sustain democracy, and yet the way we're currently teaching it is absolutely falling short. And in North Carolina, we did surveys of high schools and found that fewer than 50% had an registration class. And of those, public schools, 48% of public schools are, but only 28% of charter schools. In the variation of what that actually means, sometimes state law says that it's supposed to have registration forms available at a high school, but for some schools that is a stack of forms in the counselor's office that if you go and find it, you can request it. Sometimes it's table in the cafeteria, but only in presidential election years. The ones that are doing it right and we see higher turnout is when it's in class. Teachers are able to answer questions if they have them. The instruction tells the students that those as young as 16 are able to pre-register to vote. And that's where we see these massive impacts and actually see young people able to then participate when the time comes.
We look at different different groups and subsections of voters. And so what we're finding is if you look at 2012 versus 2016 versus 2020, we're finding that there is a momentum and there is a push for children that are 18. We call it, and when I say we, I mean CNN, we call it the Parkland effect, because a lot of the kids that were affected by Parkland, they were like 16, 17, they're turning 18, they're like 18, 19, and 20 right now. And so it's called the Parkland effect because it was that group of teenagers that was so passionate about gun reform, and they're the ones that were getting out to vote. And so what we're seeing is that there's a trend on social media, and this is one of the times where social media is actually a good thing, is that you are going to see a lot of children in 2020 who were 18, 19, 20, who weren't allowed, were not old enough to vote 4 years ago, but they are allowed to vote now. And especially when you look at these Parkland kids and what they were able to do in Florida, and they're saying, look what we did in Florida, and look what we could do nationwide. So I do think that there's going to be an uptick in 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who are going to be voting for us.
There is a big room for that. So 2018 was historic turnout, but that was an increase from 20% of 18 to 29-year-olds to 30%. So the vast majority still stayed home. So yes, I think there'll be an uptick. There's more that we as a society, more that we can do to help facilitate that.
So I got this information from a movie, so I don't know the accuracy of it, but in the movie, I think it was Vice, right? They talked about how they changed the law way back between Nixon, I forget which administration. The news in the past was a money-losing organization for the network, and they were required to, when they did the news, you always had to show both sides of a story and show news as opposed to opinion. And if you had a show that was opinion, you had to tell the public that it was an opinion. And it was very clear-cut laws that they then changed. And that led to the rise of what we now know today as a messed up news system. And so is there any talk anywhere of rolling back that law and saying we live in a democracy and we need to be able to have channels that are unbiased, like CNN that I think, and so that it isn't, if you have a news show, it is required to show us all. And I don't know how we can work that policy or if there's even talk of rolling back the laws, because it's corrupted, our our entertainment.
I can answer that. I mean, I agree with you, Tina. I remember in 2000, I can remember in 2012, 2012, I was probably the last time, and you're absolutely right. I mean, we had a law, we had a policy. If you had a Democratic candidate that was on for 3 minutes and 46 seconds, then that meant that at some time in that hour, in that show, you had to have a Republican candidate who was on for 3 minutes and 46 seconds, and it was like you had to give equal airtime, and you're right. I mean, that is no longer a policy anymore, and it's just a question of, I mean, I don't know if you can ever go back. I think the cat is, the horse has left the barn. I mean, I think we are so far away from that right now, and it's gonna take a lot to kind of. see it. I'm sorry, but right now, there are more people who, the number of people who are getting their news from television is like every day it's less than it was the day before. People no longer get their news from television. Now most people get their news from their phones. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of views versus millions of views. Right.
One of the challenges is that at one time a newspaper had an editorial page, right? And then there were the news reporters. But that's not how people are consuming even a New York Times article, that it gets shared on Facebook, and that line between editorial versus news is very blurry. It's one of the things that in my political communication classes, I always make the students kind of go into online news sites and really observe the difference on Fox News between their reporters, right, their reporting staff, and their editorials, right, so that they can be better consumers of that distinction. It's hard to think about how you legislate that exactly, but it is something in terms of an awareness of what is intended as meeting a journalistic standard versus what is an editorial.
That's exactly right. Like, what is journalism, right? Because you referenced TMZ. I will tell you, TMZ has come a long way. And you know what? We follow TMZ,
Right.
and we follow TMZ. And let me tell you something: if TMZ is talking about something that has to do in the entertainment industry, I'm here to tell you that there's a 98% chance that what they are saying is right. And it is actual, but the problem is that if TMZ can say Kobe Bryant's dead, and then they can say, oops, but if CNN says Kobe Bryant died and that's not accurate, we'll never hear the end of it. But now, TMZ is our competition. TMZ is CNN's competition. It's ABC's competition. It's the BBC's competition, as is Yahoo, as is, there are so many entities that consider themselves, news organizations, and frankly, we're all competing for the same eyeballs, right? And and everybody was getting that information about Kobe Bryant from TMZ.
Yeah,
everybody was.
That was one of my questions, because you brought that up, because when my son came to me and said, Mom, Kobe Bryant is dead. And I said, who reported that? He said, TMZ. I said, oh my God, Kobe Bryant is dead.
Right.
Because, they broke Michael Jackson, they broke John Edwards. I mean, they now have a track record. And so I wonder, how do you have those conversations and about who's a reliable source when, the gossip site is now a reliable source.
And so it's funny, because I and this is a true story, and I said I wasn't going to embarrass him, but I'm not going to embarrass him. I texted my son and I'm like, hey, I'm hearing Kobe Bryant died. He's like, Mom, you work at CNN. Why are you asking me that? And I was like, well, I just want to know, what are you? He's like, it's all over Twitter. And I was like, okay, well, then now I got to get ready and, figure out how it's going to work, But yeah, no, I mean, it is, now the blogs, they're not blogs anymore. They're reputable news, or I should say news outlets. I won't say news organizations. Right. But they're reputable.
The fundamental problem, however, is that CNN is competing with TMZ. I mean, and not CNN specifically, but media organizations are businesses, right? And as long as media organizations are businesses, they will be driven by business decisions, even at the same time that they might have higher standards than others. They fundamentally, right, are going to be feeling the economic pressures that drive speed, right, that drive celebrity, that drive the things that many of us are, worried about. And so, fundamentally, right, the U.S. does not have a strong public broadcasting investment. And
The microphone's
Oh, I'm
coming.
sorry. Oh. Hi, I'm wondering if you can advise us as extraordinary citizens on how to actually fact check our Instagram and Facebook feeds and how to respond to, we all have relatives with different political views who are on our Facebook feed. And if I send them the fact checking from Washington Post, they would say, well, that's fake news. Can you give us some advice on constructive ways to fact check, to communicate that with people who are organizations that are well respected on both sides of the aisle? Because I do think people want to know the truth. They're just getting fed a lot of stuff that isn't true on both sides.
Yeah, I'll say a few things. And in the handout, like when I teach this to students in terms of fact checking, there are some sites, and I'm sure journalists use a whole host of other ways they fact check. But I think as a citizen, Snopes.com will cover some of the bigger rumors that you're seeing on social media. Snopes.com. I also personally think it's just an interesting site to see how a story or a rumor is presented and how they go through and look for ways to kind of verify whether that happened or not. And then there are a number of political fact-checking organizations that are helpful for political related facts. I think that it's a much trickier question in terms of how to convince people that may have sort of certain biases about the sources. I think we all have a family member or friend that is like a lifelong thing we're trying to do. With me, it's my dad and his his news watching, and I've come to try to present the case that I don't care where he gets the news. I just want him to consider a few different places to look in more than just one channel, one site, and to consider what I think that people can get behind is the evidence. So look at what the materials are that are being reported on and decide for yourself. And that's kind of almost a straight librarian thing to say, here's a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different sources you can draw from. It's on you to kind of look at that and make a decision, but I think it's important for people to understand that going to just one place or not kind of doing their due diligence and doing some background reading, I think it's important for them to get that message. I don't know that that was successful in my case, talking to my family member, but I at least felt very strongly that there are facts. If you can sort of do your homework and look at these things, then you can make a decision, but don't tell me that you only heard this from this one place. I don't know if y'all have other strategies for making this.
Just a note, if you haven't looked at the last page of your handout, are the sources that Hannah is talking about.
I would just say the other thing that you said that I think really resonates is awareness of our own biases. That I think that we as consumers of information, that it's incredibly important that we not only do that looking across different sources, but also, right, be aware of our inherent biases when we're interpreting information, and try and think more critically about whether or not that your intuition, right, needs double checking.
And I think in this Alexa Google world, because my two younger children will watch something and it'll come on TV and they'll be like, okay, Google, what is this, or who is that, or but what happens is, but here's the thing, but what happens is with Google is they and CNN is one of them, so Google they contract out with different organizations so that that prioritizes where things come up on your searches. So, the thing that bothers me when, my kids are like, okay, Google, what is this? And then, Google will bring up the first page that they want you to see. So what I challenge my children is, don't just ask the Google Home, get out your tablet and go beyond what the first one is, because, when you just kind of let Google decide where they're going to get their information from, they're the one that's choosing if they're going to pick, you know, Wikipedia. And like, you know, for me, Wikipedia is like nails on a chalkboard, you know. But a lot of times, that's the first thing that comes up is the Wikipedia article. And I'm like, we don't do Wikipedia. Go beyond that, you know. And so, so that concerns me with this upcoming generation is that everything is just you could talk to Siri, you could talk to Alexa, you could talk to Bixby. But when you do that, you're letting Samsung and Apple and Google, you know, determine which story you're going to read first.
A recent study into Google's algorithm also found that one of the biggest factors in their search function is about turnover on the page, which is exactly the kind of the worst incentive in terms of what you want.
The opposite.
Right, right.
Question I like to ask students sometimes is, have you ever been to page 2 of your Google results and that doesn't happen, and you just wonder, of the billion sites and the billion pages that are available on the internet, you are like immediately figuring that results 1, 2, and 3 are like the end all be all for what's out there on this topic. So I think that that's kind of related to the algorithms and how much trust is being put in. Exactly what's on top, what's convenient, what's quick and easy is pretty problematic when you take that at a large scale and how much the algorithms are influenced by other factors.
Just related to that, I think that the loss of net neutrality has much more of a, you know, who's paying the most, and that's what comes up on our Google searches. I think that's my belief. The other thing I just wanted to add, with 3 kids in their 20s, I think a major news source is late night comedy.
Yes. Well, Trevor Noah. So again, I'm sorry, James, but you're sitting right there. But you know, you know, that generation, they're getting their news from Trevor Noah, and they're getting their news from the late night comedy show, Stephen Colbert. You know, and the great thing about that is, I mean, they are dropping you know, they are giving you the news, they're giving you the updates, but that generation, that's exactly what they're going to. James got my 12-year-old daughter like watching Trevor Noah, and I'm like, well, at least you're getting your news somewhere. So
One of the things in my classes, though, is that I challenge them to think about what that means, because John Oliver has some really great investigative stories. On the other hand, Jon Stewart was kind of famous for taking to task cable news, but saying, I'm a comedian, I'm not a journalist. And I think that's a cop-out, right? When so many people are getting information from you, then, you know, there is an obligation, I think, to be more thoughtful in what are the standards in terms of the information that you're providing. And so, you know, it is a reality that people are getting information from late night TV, and so I think that we have to be, you know, make sure to kind of push that they are also not conveying this information.
Would add memes to the source of news. I think for Duke students in my class, there's the Duke memes page, and that's where they find out about things, whether on campus or even more broadly. So I think that aspect of humor and kind of visual and quick information is powerful, and I think could be used for positive ways too.
I had a question about timing. You had said that you take a long time to figure out, you know, if a story is right before you run it. But in a time-dominant environment, I suspect that a long time for CNN might look different than it does in some other fields. And I sort of wondered what that time space looks like for you, and how you develop those thresholds of when you are confident enough to actually run a story.
Right. So, you know, there's a source, you know, there's like an unnamed source. It's like someone's like, don't use my name, don't say anything. You know, and then there's a named source that's like, nope, you can say, you know, so-and-so with LAPD, you know, detective of the, you know, the West Valley, you know, station, you know. So we always want to make sure that we at CNN and a lot of the news organizations, we follow the same thing, is that you have true independent sources, right? Because, and I say independent because, you know, like 2 people from the LAPD is not an independent source, right? Because ultimately they're getting their information from the same person, right? So we try to get 2 independent sources, or if we are very comfortable, like if I guess it varies from story to story, right? It also varies from if it's a government agency, if the governor of California, the mayor of Los Angeles, if they are coming out and saying something, as opposed to, you know, like someone. So it really varies, right? And then it also, you know, it can be if I'm like, look, there are times like with Michael Jackson when we had people who were inside the house, you know, but we couldn't say, you know, and I can't say who that person was that was inside the house, but we have a whole group of people where, you know, we had someone that was like, I'm inside the house, this happened, right? And so, but because it was Michael Jackson, we had to go like very, very, very high in the organization to say, okay, this person's in the house. It happened. Like this, you know, he is dead, right? So it's really just we have a group of people. It's like they're like our ombudsmen, and we have several conversations, and we just it's just our comfortability with who is giving us this information, where they are in relationship to this. Are they 1 degree of separation away? Are they literally watching it, you know, happen in front of their eyes? Or, you know, are they, well, I got a phone call from somebody. But, you know, and so you're right, you know, it may be 5 minutes. It may be an hour. I mean, there have been times where, you know, you know, something happened, something noteworthy and newsworthy, and every other organization had come out, and CNN was like an hour behind. And, you know, the president of CNN, if he were sitting there right now, he's like, I just want us to be accurate. Of course, I want to be first, but we just want to make sure that we have that comfortability, and that, you know, and that we are comfortable to go ahead and say this is actually what happened. So I don't think we were, you know, I mean, TMZ, they had that information for hours before the network organizations were comfortable with, you know, with reporting the information of the death of Kobe Bryant. So it could be 5 minutes, it could be an hour, but it just has to be something that we, CNN, is comfortable to go and say this happened.
And are you talking about more breaking news?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, breaking news. Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry. Did that answer your question? Oh yeah. No, 10 minutes for us is a long time. We're like, oh my gosh, it's 10 minutes, but it feels like it's an eternity. In reality, it's only 10 minutes.
Can I just, one more thing that I would love for the panel to explore, the big elephant in the room, what the effect of having the leader of our country constantly spewing things that are factually completely not true.
I mean, I could speak on a personal level. I mean, I have had people, this is a true story, I had a reporter who was on their way, and if anyone is familiar with Atlanta, they were on their way to Atlanta Hartsfield Airport, and so at one point they combined like the 2 major interstates, I-75 and I-85 together, so I'm talking about 8 lanes of traffic. This reporter was sitting in the back of a cab, and somehow it got, I guess he made a call, and it somehow became apparent that he worked at CNN, and the Uber driver let off this reporter on an interstate because, you know, he didn't want someone that worked for CNN, like pulled over to the side of the road and let this person off, said, nope, I don't want you in my cab. There are now instances where reporters, we now have reporting teams who go to certain campaign events. They have security guards there where, you know, because sometimes, depending on the rally, there are people who start chanting at them, and, you know, and sometimes, you know, the organization feels that their safety could be compromised. And so it is a challenge to be a reporter, for an organization, because it's not just, but it is a security challenge for people to be members of an organization that the president has declared, is a fake, is an organization that's against him. And there are people who believe that, and there are people who want to, defend the president, and they are, and their security is compromised, and it is so challenging now to report under that, and then have that umbrella. And in addition to everything else, we now have to worry about someone's security, that they're safe, that they are, not going to be, attacked simply because of the organization that they work for.
Just to build on that, I want to get into more of like the content of what the president might be saying, and maybe Hannah, you can speak to this. How do you navigate? What are your discussions inside about? Because there's a lot of calls to say, well, you should, when he lies, you should say he's a liar, but then sometimes it's like, well, he says he was joking, or maybe it's something else. So how do you have discussions about of the content of what he's saying and how you report it in a way that is true to the ideals of CNN, and how do you talk to students about navigating what the president might say that might be his truth, his idea of truth, versus fact?
I guess I would just say, in terms of how I would talk to students about lies and fake news and all this kind of thing, I'm there to provide people with a lot of different perspectives and give them trust that somebody's going to take on their own research and come to their independent conclusion. I do personally feel attacked in the sense that there's no such thing as truth. It's all fake. Everything, let's just bury our heads in the sand. I'm very concerned with that sort of environment that we're in right now in terms of how this presidency has led to this mistrust of all of these sources and places where people are trying to present the information that's out there. And this is a little bit idealistic, but part of me thinks one thing we need to do is teach people about what journalists do, what goes on in a newsroom to decide when a story comes out, what you do with fact checking, all of these kind of this literacy about journalism that I think has been lost, or maybe it never happened, I'm not sure, but I think finding a way to build trust in an organization that can present fact-checked information, and teaching people how to kind of understand all of the processes and things that go into putting out real information. I don't that's too optimistic to say that you're going to catch these people that are just convinced that CNN is fake news, but I feel like we need to somehow build trust back in these organizations that are putting out information.
Well, I wonder what you say to students when they say something like, there's no such thing. Because, there's water in this glass. That's the truth. So what do they mean when they say that really? What do you think they really mean?
I'm not convinced that most college students necessarily fall for fake news, or I think that it's more this kind of overwhelming sense that there's just too much information noise. They don't know how to deal with it. And so I don't personally feel that I have to dispel fake news necessarily. I don't think people are susceptible to it. Maybe kind of what you found with your study in terms of falling for this false information. But I do think it's very complicated trying to figure out how to teach them about it in a way that everyone's not just so cynical about every source they encounter on the internet.
So one thing that I might just add is that on the one hand, there are definitely some whack jobs out there, right? I mean, there's the guy who did, in fact, believe Pizzagate because he, showed up at Comet Pizza. So that's not to at all diminish the fact that, calls against, specific media organizations have put them at risk, because I absolutely think that is true. At the same time, we have seen increases in trust in media, including among Republicans. So let's not equate either the Republican Party with the things that Trump is sometimes saying that is against mainstream media organizations. Now, again, are there subsets? For sure, right? Is there reason that we should be thinking about how to confront that? For sure. And I do think that, it is a struggle for media organizations to figure out how to handle this type of media environment. I also have incredible frustration with the fact that at the end of the day, they often are still chasing the shiny object, the provocative story, the thing that is going to get a click, as opposed to, without necessarily thinking about what the consequences of following something that is just controversial for the sake of controversy. So we are in a system in which at the journalists are chasing the things that will get them the clicks, right? And that is helping to feed the beast. On the other hand, I do have faith in the American public in terms of their general, overall, right, ability to make sense of this more confusing information.
I agree with everything that you said. I mean, there are times, and just to answer your question, there are times if something is just so wrong, so just not true, journalists will say, and the president today said this, that, well, in actuality, this is how impeachment works, or this is how, and so, and all the organizations still do it. They say, well, this is what was said, but in actuality, this is how the process works, right? And so, I mean, you feel like because it's out there, you almost have to correct the public and let them know, I mean, this is actually how government works, or this is the actuality, this is what happens, this is how it works. So,
and there's cheerleading going on both sides of the aisle, where people will share things that, do they necessarily believe it, but is it a thing that kind of reinforces their worldview or gets their point across in terms of who it is they support? And so, one of the things that I find in studies of public opinion is the willingness to say something for the sake of what type of cheerleading that a particular answer will give.
There's a fine line, right? And you don't want, because you don't want people to say, oh, there goes the Washington Post again. Oh, there goes the New York Times again. Oh, there goes CNN again. Their only mission is to correct, the president, but so you don't want us to be seen as, constantly trying to, prove that, or say that the president is wrong, because you don't want to be seen as always the one that's just kind of sitting out there. But on the other side, you want to make sure that the truth is getting out, right? And so it's so hard to just not, to not be seen as constantly combating like whack-a-mole.
Right, like that. Sure. I think you had a question.
So one thing is that I will also say that podcasts are like a big way that people my age get their information. So I think that's like a very much like rapidly growing way of being informed. Like I used to listen to just one podcast every morning, and now it's like up to 3. And so I think that that's an important thing to consider. But my question was about like ethics and timeliness and facts, because those 3 things don't always go hand in hand. So like a big thing with TMZ and Kobe Bryant is that they reported it before some of the families had been reached. And so then like people whose family members had had died in this crash were hearing from Twitter that their family members were being killed. So how do you, well, not being killed, but had died in this crash. So how do you like combine breaking news and breaking news so that everyone knows, and like not creating this, like I get nervous every time I get a CNN notification on my phone. Part of that is just that I've grown up in like the time of gun violence, and like every time I get a notification, I'm scared of what it's going to say. And like, how do you keep people informed but not reticent to be informed, and also like giving them the facts that they need to know to be an informed citizen?
You know, that is the struggle that we face every day, and again, right? I mean, the Kobe Bryant story. I mean, it was what, 2 weeks ago. I mean, that is going to be a fascinating case study, right? Because yes, there were 8 other families that were, or not 8 other families. There were 8 other people who I'm sure that flying on a helicopter with Kobe Bryant is something that they were telling their family, they were telling their friends about, because that's just not something that happens every single day. And so, and I heard I can't think of his last name. I heard his argument, because he got a lot of backlash from the LAPD, from the state of California, from other media organizations about, there were other families on board, because he was saying, yeah, well, we had been in touch with the Bryant family, right? But what about those 5 other families that were, on board? And so what do you do as a news organization? Because, and there were, because everyone was looking to ABC and CBS and the LA Times, right, and CNN to say, like, what happened. And so, you could say there was an accident, and then there was a helicopter accident, in Calabasas, right? But it was, you do want to think about, and we go through this with school shootings all the time, right? Because there are families, there are parents that are watching, CNN and MSNBC and Fox, and so you really struggle with, is it the right thing to kind of, if the situation is over, if it's done, if the gunman has been located and arrested, as in Parkland, is it important to get that information out and to say yes, and also there are, if there are, it's a school of 1,000 people, do you want to say, well, there are, 20 people, and that's horrible, and that's tragic, and that's sad, but, there are 20 people who, 20 families that just lost their loved one. There are 980 other families who need to know that that situation is over, and that, and so it is a struggle that we deal with every single day, and you really want to be as compassionate as you are, because there are people who are intimately involved, but there's also, and with the case of Kobe Bryant, it was already out there. TMZ had already said this happened. It is unfortunate that it happened, and it would have been nice had the coroner, been the first person to report that it had happened. But at this point, the story was all, was out there, and so you almost had to do, the responsibility to be that organization to say yes, it in fact happened, and was unfortunate for those 5 other families. I think I got the last question. That was the last question. So thank you for coming. Thank you to the panelists.